Hey everyone, Ken Cannon here again with Living in Raleigh, North Carolina, the channel that helps you learn why the Triangle area is one of the coolest places in the Southeast to live. We're going to be doing something a little bit different this video. Instead of looking at a particular area in the Triangle, we're going to be talking about what it takes to buy a house in this market today. As many of you know, markets across the country are insane right now, but the Triangle market in particular is very, very active. So we're going to be talking today about what it takes to buy a house, to succeed in this market, and come out ahead. All right. Stay tuned, and remember, if you are thinking about moving to the area and would like some help with that move, our team helps people move here from all over the country. We'd be happy to help you too. Just contact us at the info below and we would be happy to help you. All right, let's do it. You're watching Living in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is your host, Ken Cannon, here to tell you why living in Raleigh, Durham, or Chapel Hill, North Carolina is the coolest place in the Southeast. All right, thanks for watching and stay tuned. All right, so the first thing we have to talk about is what does the market look like today in the Triangle? If we look at just market sales alone, we'll see that we're up near 30% in some areas of the Triangle. And that's just insane. That's year over year. So if you bought a house last year, you gained 30% in just the span of 1 year. So that's pretty wild to me, but that's indicative of what's going on in today's market. We also have to look at the inventory issue. For many years now, we've had a low inventory issue that's been steadily driving prices up as more and more people move to this area. And as more great jobs are announced, as we've discussed in some of the other videos on this channel, we get more and more people moving to this area, which continues to drive prices up, puts pressure on that low inventory. Builders, for the most part, have started to try and move towards building single families. However, they've spent most of their time building apartment complexes and condos over the last few years. So there's been this kind of imbalance in what the market has been looking for and what's been being provided by the builders. And so, those forces mean that the market is as competitive as ever. In addition to the inventory issues and the rising prices, we have other forces that are pushing in on this market to make it a little bit more intense. We have inflation as a whole is driving investors to hard assets, so that lower pricing tier of homes is being, a lot of money is flooding into that from both private individual investors and corporate investors too. I'm sure you've heard some of the institutional names like BlackRock and Vanguard who have come into communities and started buying up single family homes, and they're capable of paying 20, 30, 40% over list price, which as a first-time home buyer is pretty hard to compete with. And the last thing I'll touch on about the state of the market today is the speed at which the market is moving. Homes are selling in 0 to 3 days regularly. Anything going beyond 5 days at this point is starting to raise some red flags for buyers, because it's like, what's wrong with this home? There might not be anything wrong with it. They might have priced it wrong or something like that. And sometimes where we used to see, a home languishing for 30 days or more would be an indication of perhaps something wrong with the listing. Now, if it's like over a week, we're starting to ask questions. And the reason being is because the market is moving so fast. Many homes are being listed as coming soon, and by the time they've even hit the market, they've already got, a couple of sight unseen offers in hand. And so it's very, very rapid moving right now, and you have to be prepared to jump in. All right, let's get to the actual buying process in this market. What does it look like to be a buyer in this market? And how do you need to position yourself so that if you are a buyer, you can succeed? The first thing I tell all of the clients that I work with is be prepared. You have to mentally be prepared. You have to financially be prepared. You have to have all of your ducks in a row ahead of time to get into this market and be able to win. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like being proactive in your search rather than reactive. The days of going out and just, perusing a couple open houses and taking time to get familiar with the market and then turning around and putting in an offer at your leisure and having that offer win, those days are behind us, at least for right now and for the foreseeable future. If you have a timeline by which you're trying to purchase a house, you really need to be thinking a few months in advance so that you can be prepared when the time comes to make offers. When we talk about being prepared, you have, again, being proactive with your search. So that means observing the coming soon properties, trying to get in, whether it's you or your agent that you're working with trying to get into those homes as quickly as possible so that you can see them, have enough time to assess them, and come up with an offer if that's what you want to do before an offer deadline. So what does an example of that look like? Well, we're seeing many homes being listed in the market on a Monday or Tuesday as coming soon. They go active later in the week, whether Thursday or Friday, and then by Sunday there's an offer deadline, and so that's calling for highest and best offer to be submitted. And typically we see that in properties where there's going to be multiple offers, and they know it's going to be competitive, they'll put in a deadline. Or if they've received, if the listing agent has received a couple offers as well in hand, and they want to just give some agents and the market, you know, the rest of the weekend to come through and see, they will quite often put that deadline so agents and potential buyers have time to get their stuff together. But it's not a lot of time, and sometimes, especially you know, last year coming into this year, when we were kind of coming out of the COVID thing, there were many homes that didn't allow overlapping showings, and so you had a very finite window in which you could get into the home before there was an offer deadline. And if you didn't do that, you oftentimes didn't even get to see the home before it was under contract. So fortunately, that's not the case anymore. More and more homes are opening up to overlapping showings, which allow more than one agent and their clients to be there at once. People are becoming more comfortable with that, so it does give us a little bit more breathing room, but not much, especially when offer deadlines are so common, because you got to get in there, you got to kind of do your assessment on it, run the numbers, find out what your offer looks like, and then get it to the listing agent before the deadline. All right, now let's talk about what the actual offer process looks like. If you found a home that you like and you want to move forward putting in an offer, what does that look like in today's market? Well, the first thing I should mention, again, this goes back to being prepared, is you're probably in a multiple offer situation, right? So there's multiple people competing and everybody has different circumstances. So what does that mean? Well, you might have somebody who's bringing financing to the table and they're putting 20% down. You might have somebody who's bringing financing to the table that's only putting 3% down. You might have a physician's loan where they're putting 0 down and they're coming with 100% financing. Or you have a cash buyer, right? So there's many different ways that real estate is bought and many different offers that could be submitted. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because going back to being prepared and the mindset aspect of this, it's very important when you're dealing with multiple offers not to get caught up in the wondering what other buyers could be doing, what other buyers might be offering. There are a couple key factors and key, I call them pieces on the board that you get to play with that, you know, everybody has those same variables, but how they, what they look like for each person is different. So what we will do when we go to talk about constructing an offer, and we'll get more into this when we actually get into the offer process in this video, but we will look at those pieces and find the best way to arrange them for the buyer. And then once everyone's comfortable with that, I tell my buyers, I say, you know, put on blinders. We have to just focus on what's comfortable for us as a buyer that we can live with, and kind of tune out what everybody else can do, because we can drive ourselves crazy worrying about what everybody else might be doing and what those circumstances, those pieces on the board might look like for them. All right, some other ways you can be prepared for when it comes to offer time is having your agency documents already in place. Your agent cannot write an offer for you legally without having those agency documents in place. And if you're coming up against a very short deadline to have your offer in, that's just more documents you've got to fill out before you can actually submit that offer. So rather than create a time crunch for you by waiting to the last minute to put those documents in place, go ahead and get them out of the way. And that way you fully understand that and you're not being bombarded with all of this information at once, you know, between the agency agreement and the disclosures and all of this stuff, and not to mention the offer to purchase and the accompanying documents with that. You know, it's a lot at once, it's a lot to process, especially if you have such a limited amount of time to do so. So go ahead and get those agency agreements out of the way, get them in place, that way everyone's on the same page moving forward, and it's just less paperwork for you to fill out when the time comes. One more thing to make sure that you are prepared to make an offer is to go ahead, whether you are a cash buyer or you are going to have financing, is to go ahead and either have your proof of funds if you're a cash buyer in place, or go ahead and get your pre-qualification in place. Now, if you're working with a lender, sometimes they will recommend doing individual pre-qualifications for a particular property, in which you just, you know, as you're putting together the offer paperwork, you just shoot your lender an email or a call and say, hey, I need a pre-qualification for this particular address. They will write it. It's often a copy and paste job for them, so it, you know, the turnaround on it is usually pretty quick. You can also get a general one too for a certain amount. If you know you're going to be shopping in a certain price range, you can go ahead and just get a one size covers all type pre-qual. The problem with that is if you do pick one number and you're going to stick with that, then what if you find one that's slightly above that? What if you find you've put in an offer that's significantly below that, and but you've submitted what kind of shown your hand, so to speak, shown your cards, and now a seller says, well, hey, you're pre-qualified for this much, why not give me that much? So you may open yourself up to some stuff with a general one. However, in this market, when it is moving as fast as it is, it's not the worst idea to just have one in your back pocket that you can bust out in the event that your lender can't get you a specific one. All right, now let's talk about the funding of a purchase in today's market. So again, going back to being prepared, you want to have this piece in place before you're even submitting an offer. Again, from a lending standpoint, they won't know specifically what your offer price is, your purchase price, until you're under contract, and your agent will send that contract to them. However, knowing that you're pre-qualified up to a certain amount, having that in your back pocket, being able to submit that pre-qual, it's almost standard in today's market. There was a time where you could submit an offer, get that offer accepted, and then go out and find financing. That's not the market we're in. Sellers are savvy. They want to know that if they're agreeing to go under contract with a buyer, that buyer's already pre-approved or at least pre-qualified, and there's not going to be any lending issues coming up along the way. If you're a cash buyer, great. Cash is wonderful. It does streamline things. However, you will need to have a proof of funds in place. We talked about that. As a cash buyer, however, you're going to be competing in a market against people who have access to funding through financing. And so, where in the past you might have seen that a cash buyer was a preferred buyer, if somebody who's getting a loan can bid up their offer price because they have that flexibility within the lending, they might end up being more attractive than, say, a cash buyer at a lower price who is limiting their ceiling because they want to stay all cash. So what does that mean? That means I've seen several buyers with significant all-cash budgets get beat out by people who have financing in their corner and can outbid them. Now, the downside to the financing, and if you run into it, is appraisal shortfall. So you can't just, because you're pre-approved, bid to the sky and hope that your price is going to be okay, because they'll, if that gets accepted, you're likely going to come up against an appraisal shortfall. What is an appraisal shortfall? Well, an appraisal shortfall, let me back up. If you're getting a loan, it's likely a loan for a certain percentage of the value. What does that mean? Well, in a conventional loan, it's typically 80% loan to value. So for easy numbers' sake, if you are dealing with a $200,000 home, which good luck finding in today's market, but let's just say you were dealing with a $200,000 home, then an 80% loan to value would be $160,000 of that purchase, meaning the buyer would be responsible for bringing $40,000 to the closing table. Now, let's just say that you've put in a $200,000 offer on this home, but this home only appraises for $150,000. Well, now we have a shortfall that we need to come up with, because they're still only going to be lending on 80% of that value, which 80% of $150,000 is $120,000. So now we have a $200,000 offer price with a $120,000 loan to value. That's an $80,000 shortfall in that example that the buyer would have to bring to closing. So we quickly went from having to bring $40,000 down payment to $80,000 down payment just because we missed the appraisal mark and there's an appraisal shortfall. What are some tips for dealing with an appraisal shortfall? Well, first of all, whenever you're making your offer price, you want to be thinking about what the appraiser is going to be ultimately appraising it. And of course, this is just speaking to those who are involving financing. If you're a cash buyer, that's one of the advantages of being a cash buyer. You don't need an appraisal. You just sail right through. It's your money. If you want to spend it that way, that's totally fine. If the bank is putting their money in, they want to know what they're spending their money on is actually worth it. So that's why an appraisal is involved. So again, going back to this idea of an appraisal shortfall and having to come up with the difference, when it comes time to making the offer, one of the things that I strongly suggest is taking a look at the resources that you have available and saying, okay, how much of a deficit would I be comfortable with? How much of a shortfall would I be capable of compensating for should one arise? Then what you do is you have your agent run comps for you to see what information an appraiser is going to be looking at. That information is going to feed into their valuation of the home as they do their appraisal. Now, if they're a smart appraiser and they're staying in tune with the market, they will also account for momentum in the market and an upward swing. So it wouldn't just be putting weight on past sales that are static figures stuck in the past, and sometimes depending on the volume of sales that are occurring in a particular area, you may see more comps, more recent comps, or you may see less. So if you're pulling data from last year, like we said at the beginning of this video, we're seeing 30% increase, right? So we can't base our appraisal off of this time last year's home price. So again, if they're a smart appraiser, they will take that, they'll take into consideration momentum, and they will kind of factor that in when valuing the house. That said, you cannot guarantee that that's who you're going to end up working with, because nobody has control over the appraiser that comes out and does the appraisal. What happens is banks order the appraisals, they have a pool of appraisers that they work with, an individual appraiser will select it. It's like a lottery thing. You never know who you're going to get. Sometimes you get somebody who's in the neighborhood, who knows the neighborhood, who's seeing the momentum and can account for that. And sometimes you get somebody who's driven over from like 4 counties away and doesn't know their way around and is just looking at last year's data trying to come up with a valuation of today's price. In that case, you may very well likely see an appraisal shortfall, because if your offer's been accepted, it was likely an offer at today's price, today's market, what today's market is demanding, which we're seeing, again, many offers going above list. You're going to come in with a certain amount offer price. They're looking at last year's data. There could very well be a shortfall in between those two things. So again, preparing yourself, sometimes and quite often you do have a savvy appraiser who will come along and recognize that momentum, and you won't have any appraisal issues at all. So it's not a guarantee in this market that the offer prices are rising faster than the appraisers can keep up, but there is a potential for that happening, and it has to be considered. So again, going back to assessing your offer, going back to assessing an appraisal shortfall, you take the information, the same information is available to an agent that is available to a appraiser. So you take that information and you try to create a range at which you think this thing will likely appraise. And then from that range, you build your comfort level based on your resources and say, okay, well, if I had to come up with a $15,000, let's say for example, shortage, if I had to cover that, I could. And if we look at the lower end of our range, that's within the lower end of our range. And so if worst case scenario, if that's what happened, we'd still be okay. If, for instance, you are in a situation where every available resource you have is already going to the down payment amount, and then we look at a range and say, okay, well, we've made this high offer so that we can get an offer accepted, but the lower end of the range, has a difference. We're already maxed out with every resource going to the down payment. There isn't anything else available to cover a shortfall. What could end up happening in that scenario if a shortfall did arise is that you'd end up having to walk away from the deal because you didn't have enough cash to come to closing. I've seen that happen, unfortunately. I've seen people have to walk away from due diligence money that they put down because having to bring the rest of the cash to cover an appraisal shortfall wasn't a viable option for them. So it's very unfortunate. It does happen. Again, it's all why being prepared is so important, and kind of understanding these things ahead of time is so important. The worst part about that story is that when this deal fell out, the buyer who came in behind them, of course, their appraiser came in and appraised it well above where it needed to be for the particular client before. So kind of a sad example of some of the varying opinions that you can get in this market and how that can impact a particular buyer. All right, let's talk about another element of the transaction that I think is a little scary to some people. It's this, the idea of due diligence. First of all, what is the due diligence deposit amount? It is let me back up. Historically, we never had a due diligence. We are what's considered a due diligence state now, but it hasn't always been that way. So the way it used to be is you put down an earnest money deposit. If you were a buyer, you wrote your offer, and your offer had an earnest money deposit attached to that offer. That earnest money would go into escrow when the offer was accepted, and it would sit there to be rewarded as damages for any breach of contract along the way between being signed and closed. Along the way, we morphed into a due diligence state where we now have two deposits that are associated with the transaction. The first one is the due diligence deposit, and the second is the earnest money deposit. So let's talk about the due diligence right now. Due diligence money is money that goes directly to the seller from the buyer to say, I'm going to compensate you this amount to take your property off the market while I conduct my due diligence and learn if this is the home that I want to buy. I will also put down this earnest money deposit that goes into escrow, so not your pocket seller. It goes into escrow and sits safely in there should I breach the contract at any time past this due diligence period. So, what did that look like before? Well, in what we consider the normal market, we'd see buyers want to put down the least amount possible for due diligence. Again, that's money that goes straight into the seller's pocket, so that's exposure for the buyer. They would put down the least amount possible to still be taken seriously in that department, and put the rest in the earnest money that sits in escrow that buyer can get back if they back out within the due diligence period. So that money was safe sitting in escrow. The buyer didn't have to worry about being exposed there, as long as if they were going to terminate the contract for any reason, they did so within the due diligence period. So now what we're seeing, because offers are so competitive, we are seeing buyers use due diligence as a way of attracting the seller to their offer. What are we seeing? What does an example of that look like? Well, where we used to see, let's just go back to our $200,000 house example, we might see a total of $3,000 deposit with $1,000 going to due diligence and $2,000 going and sitting in escrow for the rest of the period until closing. Both of those amounts get credited towards the purchase at the end. Nowadays, let's just take I'll give you a real example. We are seeing homes in the $250,000 to $300,000 range with $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 due diligence. That's money that doesn't come back under any circumstance to the buyer. So the buyer's saying, here's $30,000, I'm buying this, unless there is a problem that we encounter that's more than $30,000, I'm not walking away from this. And to a seller, that's very, very, very attractive. Money in their pocket right away, they haven't even sold the thing and it's in the tens of thousands of dollars. That's a big, hey, look at me on an offer to purchase. So the due diligence has become a point of competition where it never really was before. It now has become a very significant point of competition. So how do we deal with a competitive DD market? Well, again, going back to what I said before, we have to be prepared. We have to know what the comfort level is. What am I comfortable walking away from as a buyer? Would I be, let's say I put down $10,000 in due diligence money, if something came up that made me just say, I cannot buy this place, am I comfortable walking away from $10K knowing that I gave it my best shot and there were circumstances beyond my control? If you're not comfortable walking away from that money if you had to, then that's not the amount for you. I stress this with all of the clients that I work with. We have to set what our comfort parameters are that are going to let us sleep at night, and put on blinders. If we don't, we're going to drive ourselves crazy. We're going to drive ourselves crazy worrying about what other people are doing. We're going to drive ourselves crazy worrying about, did we pay too much? Did we put too much on the line? All of these things are just going to come back to haunt us along the way. And so it's very important that you set your parameters realistically, of course, right? You can't come in and say, well, I want, a 3,000 square foot brand new construction house for $100,000 because that's my comfort level. That's not going to work. But within reason, you have to set your comfort levels and stick there and know that, hey, if it doesn't work on this deal, a deal will come along where it does work. But you have to stay diligent and you have to stay kind of focused. So I will say there's no correct amount for due diligence. The more you can, the better in terms of a seller's opinion. They're going to be looking at that as, hey, that's great. That's a very compelling way to compete. But no more than you feel comfortable with, because otherwise it's just going to chew you up. So there's no point in doing that. Along those same lines, I get asked by clients all the time, well, what should I offer for this home? What is the right offer price for this home? And I cannot tell my clients the exact right offer price, because I can give them data and I can tell them, ranges that say, okay, somewhere between this price and this price, I think is what the market would support. I think, we'd be likely to be successful within this range. Again, there's multiple variables that go into constructing the offer. Different clients have different circumstances that allow them to be varying degrees of flexible with those factors. And so there is no one-size-fits-all formula for constructing an offer. Again, it relies heavily on available resources. It relies on setting those comfort parameters. And of course, if there's seller requests, we want to understand those seller requests too, so that we can make an attractive offer and that we're accommodating those seller requests in this market. Again, there are other markets where sellers are bending over backwards for buyers because there's just not that many, the inventory is too much and houses are languishing and all that, but that's not the market we're in. Today's video is about 2022, and in this market, buyers are jumping through all sorts of hoops to attract sellers into just accepting their offer and agreeing to sell their home, boneless, oftentimes, to the buyer. Okay, I've mentioned previously the pieces on the board idea, which is what are the variables that I have to work with when constructing an offer that you would have to work with when constructing your offer should you be a buyer. And there's only a handful of them, and every buyer is dealing with these same variables, and so these are the pieces that we get to move around. The first one is obvious, it's offer price. How much are you willing to pay for the home? The second one we talked about is due diligence amount. How much am I willing to put down and walk away from right now so that I can conduct my due diligence and understand if this is the home that I want to move forward with purchasing. There's the earnest money deposit. That's the other deposit that we mentioned that goes into escrow. That becomes active from the point of the expiration of the due diligence period, between that point and closing. So if you were to, as a buyer, breach the contract from any point between the end of the due diligence period and the closing date, then those damages would be rewarded to the seller. If you were to terminate the contract ahead of the expiration of due diligence, so within the due diligence period, you would actually be refunded that earnest money amount. Again, that's why that used to be the majority amount, not in today's case. So there's the earnest money amount. The next variable is the due diligence period. How long of a period do you want to be able to walk out of this contract for the due diligence amount that you put down? So I recommend in today's market a minimum of 21 days. The reason being is we have to get appraisers in there if there's financing involved, and those are the weakest link in the chain right now. Those are the ones that are taking longer to turn around. It's only about 10 days right now, average turnaround, but we want to build that buffer in there because the bank, there's a couple moving pieces in order to even get them in motion. So give ourselves that 3-week, that 21-day window, and that way we're confident we can get all of our inspections done as well as the appraisal completed from the bank and have all that figured out so that we know by the end of due diligence that we do want to move forward with this. Another variable is the settlement date. The settlement date is the date on which the property will close, which you will officially purchase the property and then take ownership. Some sellers want a typical 30-day close, which is what we see usually in the market. There are some sellers who say, you know what, I'm putting my house on the market now because the market's great, but I don't really want to close this thing until the summer when my kids are out of school, so can we wait until then? And if you are flexible in your move-in schedule, you might be able to accommodate the seller, and then that becomes a more attractive offer to the seller. So knowing that settlement date and how to manipulate that settlement date if it is something that they're interested in is also another useful piece on the board. And lastly, there are a couple other smaller pieces on the board that you can move around. However, in today's market, we rarely see them implemented, and those are seller paid costs toward closing and a seller paid home warranty. Again, those are things that in more peaceful waters, you would have seen, requests for seller paid toward closing or a seller paid home warranty. You might see that asked for by a buyer, but now in today's market, when buyers are basically putting their highest and best offer first, they're leaving those things out of the offer to make themselves more attractive to the seller. All right, so now that we kind of talked about the things that go into making an offer, let's talk about the actual offer process itself and what that looks like. So you are going to, first thing, have to be responsive in this market. You're going to be responsive to offer deadlines. You're going to have to be responsive to paperwork as it comes forward. For the most part, All of this stuff is being handled electronically now, so it's very easy to handle these things remotely. You don't have to worry about scheduling and getting together to handle these things, but you do want to be prepared to sign things, you know, in a timely manner and get those back to the agent that you're working with so that they can get those to the listing agent in time and make sure that you beat any deadline that's in place. Things that you'll want to make sure that you submit with your offer, not just the offer to purchase, but you're also going to be requested to sign some disclosures. Those disclosures are the residential property owner's disclosure, as well as the mineral oil and natural gas disclosure. Those are state forms that are required with any purchase. The seller discloses certain attributes of the home and that the buyer sign off on those. You're going to want to sign off on those and have those submitted with the offer, as well as your pre-qual or proof of funds. Having all of that paperwork put together, signed in a timely manner is just going to help you better succeed. All right, so we've talked about what goes into an offer, we've talked about how to submit your offer. Now let's talk about what happens after your offer gets accepted. Well, once your offer gets accepted, the clock is ticking on due diligence. So you will have submitted that due diligence amount to the seller. That's gone into their pocket, not to be seen again until closing, when it gets credited towards the purchase price. But again, the clock is ticking, so we're off and running. What does that mean? We need to get the inspections in place. What kind of inspections? Home inspection is pretty much standard on all homes unless you're buying it to tear it down. You're going to want to get a wood destroying insect inspection in this area. We have a very humid climate, which means we get a lot of, we see termites, we see all sorts of, carpenter bees, we see all sorts of wood destroying insects in this climate. And for some homes that can be a problem. For others, you know, there is no problem. But knowing that, you'd want to certainly know that within the due diligence period. So that's something that could be addressed. The point of the due diligence period is for you to conduct your due diligence and also prepare any requests that you might have for the seller for them to perform to the home before you close. So, other things that are happening during that period, the appraisal has been ordered. It will be conducted during that period. So you will likely get an appraisal back, ideally get the appraisal number back before the end of due diligence. This is where you will see if there are any shortfalls. You will see what the house is appraised for and get kind of a more finite number of how much you're going to have to bring to close. If, for instance, you do run into a appraisal shortfall, there are things you can do other than just bringing cash to the table. You can have your bank submit a review for the appraisal to have that reviewed and see if you can actually appeal it. That said, I haven't been too successful with those. I've seen some examples where it's come back and worked, but for the most part, I wouldn't rely on that if you were going to be making a high offer price. More in due diligence, you're going to be buttoning up your financing. You're going to have all of your inspections in place, and you're going to be feeling pretty confident moving from the end of the due diligence into the remaining period before closing. The due diligence period is also where you will put together a list of repair requests, if any, for the seller. Now, in today's competitive market, we see sellers being less and less accommodating of buyers' repair requests because they feel, hey, you agreed to take this house as is, and you agreed to pay above list for it, and now you're coming back to me and saying you want me to do something different than what we agreed upon. And I will emphasize that when you put an offer in on a house in North Carolina, you're buying the house as is, so the seller is under no obligation to actually do any repairs to the home. That said, we see in most transactions that sellers are still somewhat accommodating. They recognize that, for the most part, they want to hand over a safe, functioning home to the next buyer, and they are willing to do little things, sometimes big things, if requested. However, we're seeing those requests less and less, and we're seeing those repairs less and less as a factor of today's market. It wasn't that long ago where you, as a buyer, could have the seller put on a new roof on the house, or put in a new HVAC system, or something big like that, some big ticket item that might have been looming as a new potential homeowner. You could have the seller take care of it. But in today's market, unless it's a really high-end price tag, we're not seeing that happen. And it's just because the seller says, well, if you want to walk away over an HVAC system, there's somebody else waiting to buy the home. So, yeah. All right, so now let's just look at the period after the expiration of due diligence and on to closing. So you made it through due diligence, you've gotten your appraisal, the funding is figured out, that's pretty much in place, ready to go. You will have negotiated any repair requests. They will be in motion if not completed already, agreed to be completed by the end or by settlement, and you're starting to shift your focus towards taking ownership of the home. So that means turning on your utilities, forwarding your mail or having it scheduled to be forwarded at a certain date, that sort of thing. So anticipating moving into the home and the things that you will need to do on day one to take ownership. Between now and then, between the end of due diligence and settlement date, remember that's when the earnest money has gone hot. So if you were to breach the contract between that period, not only would you be out the due diligence amount that you've already surrendered, but now the earnest money as well would be non-refundable. So always keep that in mind. But usually around this time, things are sailing pretty smooth. The transaction has gone through most of its hurdles and now it's just waiting to close. There's still the potential for things to come up, especially if there's lenders involved. Oftentimes last minute changes to lending documents can kind of throw things for a spin, but for the most part, it's smooth sailing between the end of DD and settlement. So then the last thing is to close on the home. And so you will have your agreed upon settlement date. The buyer chooses the closing attorney for the most part, unless it's written into the agreement otherwise. The buyer chooses the attorney, so the buyer will have already submitted a lot of information to the attorney. The attorney will have pulled together a lot of things on behalf of the buyer, such as the title search. If there's a survey involved, the attorney will have reviewed the survey and made comments if necessary. And if there's a loan involved as well, they will have received that loan packet and pull it all together so that when the buyer shows up to closing to receive the keys, they sign off on all the documents, on the lending documents, they sign off on the deed, and then they receive a package at the end with all of those copies of all of those documents and the keys. Well, actually, I take that back. You don't receive the keys in North Carolina until the home has officially recorded, which most attorneys are recording digitally, so it's like an hour after you walk out of the office. You usually get the feedback that, hey, this thing has recorded. You're now safe to give the keys to the buyer. But yeah, that's really it. Well, there you have it. We've taken a pretty solid look at what it takes to win buying a house in today's market. So there's a lot to it. There's a lot to take in there, and it's very fast-paced in today's market. All the more reason to have a great team at your side. If you're thinking about moving to the area, or you're already in the area and just want to jump into the market, reach out to us at the contact information below. My team would be happy to help you. All right, until the next video, this has been Ken Cannon with Living in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'll talk to you soon.